The acquisition of logical knowledge occurs in three main steps: perception, cognition, and conception. The foundation of all logical knowledge derives from perception, either something directly observed or something indirectly observed. These initial observations provide first impressions that allow us to recognize essential features and develop a familiarity with the observed subject. These impressions derived from perceptions develop into a stage of cognition, where general ideas about the subject are developed from direct or indirect experiences derived from prior observations. Finally, this conception stage begins when reason is used to form models and explain concepts and perceptions. To display this development, we can look at an analysis of capitalism. One may observe bourgeois society and derive initial impressions based on these observations, such as how the workers suffer and toil under the rule of capitalists. These perceptions lead to cognition, where general insights, such as the workers having no say in the governing of bourgeois society or no control over the conditions in which they live. Finally, the conception stage tries to answer why this is, hypothesizing that perhaps this is due to private ownership of the means of production and the extraction of surplus value by the capitalist that enables this dynamic to occur. True knowledge and practice. In order for the truth value of logical knowledge to be verified, as with any scientific hypothesis, it must be subjected to tests and further refined to correct errors and develop a more accurate model. The process of subjecting logical knowledge to tests is known as practice, and is a key component for the formation of theoretical frameworks which have both explanatory and predictive power. Often through practice, the models produced by logical knowledge are amended or even discarded altogether and replaced with a better model in light of new experience derived from practice. It is through the process of forming logical knowledge and subjecting it to practice that true knowledge can be derived. This is why the dialectical materialist method is superior to the methods of the rationalists and the empiricists. The individual limitations and merging of rationalism and empiricism. Rationalism is a rejection of the perception stage of acquiring logical knowledge and of practice to acquire true knowledge. To the rationalist, cognition and conception alone are required to gain logical knowledge. However, by rejecting perception and practice, they become unaware of whether or not these conceptions are a reflection of observable reality. They believe reality can be understood purely through reason and deduction, whereas empiricism attempts to derive knowledge purely through perception and becomes unable to further elaborate on these observations by engaging in cognition and conception. Rationalism prioritizes models and struggles to explain discrepancies between perceptions and practices with their models, while empiricism prioritizes data and struggles to contextualize this data within a model framework derived from cognition and conceptualization. Dialectical materialism seeks to merge the model formation of rationalism and the data procurement of empiricism to produce true knowledge. Logical knowledge alone is not sufficient. It is not merely enough to study the works of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, nor is it enough to familiarize yourself with communist history and the nuances of different issues within the movement. Logical knowledge, that is, knowledge derived through study of perception, cognition, and conception, will always be secondary to the true knowledge derived from practice. In other words, it is by directly engaging and advancing in the class struggle that gives the Communist Party its true knowledge. One can gain much from a scholarly study of Maoism, but scholarly knowledge alone becomes the knowledge of an academic, not a revolutionary. To place scholarly logical knowledge above practice becomes dogmatism. Dogmatism is when practice becomes disregarded in favor of a rigid interpretation of theory and the elevation of logical knowledge without practice. A dogmatist forgets the goal of Maoism is to provide a scientific model for revolution. Like any science, it does not merely provide hypotheses, but requires experimentation. The class struggle becomes a laboratory of revolutionary science. Maoism itself is derived from the historical experience of the class struggle. So by rejecting the primacy of true knowledge derived from practice, the dogmatist rejects Maoism. Dialectical and historical materialism deals with the real, the physical. It is idealism which deals with the metaphysical. The dogmatist will quote the words of Mao or Marx and treat them as the infallible words of God, rather than accept the fact that Mao and Marx were human beings and products of their time. Although brilliant, these thinkers were not perfect, and to robotically recite their words without sufficient thought being given to concrete material reality or the context in which these words were spoken will enshrine a dogmatic and rigid interpretation of theory. This trend becomes known as Dogmato-revisionism because it is a sequence in which dogmatism leads directly to revisionism. For example, this manifests as the default reaction to uphold whatever Marx or Lenin or Stalin or some other figurehead did or believed, and that we must follow their methods exactly, even in light of different circumstances or new knowledge gained through practice. Dogmato-revisionism becomes revisionist precisely because it rejects practice and the acquirement of true knowledge, which could advance the revolution and resolve previous errors. The errors become enshrined and the scientific method is rejected with a quasi-religious fidelity. The Marxism of dogmato-revisionists is not dialectical materialism, but rather an idealist and metaphysical distortion. In other fields of science, such as physics, a dogmatist may cite the works of Isaac Newton to argue against Albert Einstein or Stephen Hawking's discoveries. When old models clash with concrete reality, they must be amended or disregarded to form a new model which does match reality. It is the scientific nature of Maoism that grants it the new ability to be refined and improved over time. Rigid and narrow interpretations which clash with material reality will only serve to alienate the party from the class struggle. Gaining true knowledge through practice. A communist must test their theory through the crucible of the class struggle. By engaging in the world, experiential knowledge is gained, and theory can be further refined. This is what enabled Marxism to form away from utopian socialism, and what enabled Marxism-Leninism to break away from the rigid and dogmatic Marxism of the Second International. In the same manner, Maoism is the culmination of all true knowledge gained through the history of the class struggle. By maintaining this mass line, the party remains in touch with the masses of the working class and gains knowledge and awareness. By engaging in People's War, the Communist Party gains experience in fighting the bourgeois state and consolidating their revolutionary gains. And by maintaining the revolutionary road through line struggle within the party, they remain forever vigilant against the constant threat of revisionism to mislead and misguide the revolution. Criticism and self-criticism. Communists must be humble and recognize their inability to achieve perfection and to know everything. They must be willing to listen to constructive criticism from the revolutionary masses of the working class and from other party members. They must also be willing to criticize oneself in order to correct errors made and to refine their theory and practices. Communists must recognize that mistakes and errors will be made, as the project to build socialism is a monumental task that will require a great degree of experimentation, but these mistakes and errors should be minimized and corrected swiftly to ensure the momentum of the socialist project and the goodwill of the masses. A bad scientist will attempt to force the evidence to conform to their model, despite its flaws. A good scientist, and a good revolutionary, will seek to refine their model in light of new evidence. This process of refinement can only be done if one is willing to constructively criticize and be constructively criticized. Maoism is already a greatly refined model. However, it is also a relatively new horizon of revolutionary theory. Therefore, Maoists need to be willing to test and refine their theory through practice and through criticism. To avoid criticism and refuse to self-criticize, a communist will become a rigid dogmatist who adopts commandism and revisionism. Care must also be taken that criticism is genuine and not meant to stall the socialist project or to inject revisionism into the party's practice. As always, the party must remain forever vigilant of revisionism disguised as legitimate criticism. So that about does it for this episode, everyone. Just to review, we talked about the 3 stages of acquiring logical knowledge: the stage of perception, the stage of cognition, and the stage of conception. We also talked about what constitutes true knowledge as knowledge derived from practice. And we also talked about the limitations of rationalism and empiricism and how dialectical materialism merges these 2 lines of thought together. And we also talked about how knowledge must be immersed and derived from practice. We discussed the issues of dogmatism and dogmato-revisionism. We talked about criticism and self-criticism. And so that about does it for this episode. Thank you everybody for watching. On episode 11, we will discuss the mass line. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what you think in the comment section below, and I'll catch you next time. Danky Gang out.